Okay, this video is for the beginning of Module 16, and Module 16 starts a new unit on national income and price determination. All right, so to begin with, I did an activity in class to illustrate something having to do with how consumer spending affects GDP. So I wanted to be able to kind of explain what we did in class because I'm going to reference it later on at the end of this video. So just to kind of explain what happened in class this was the activity that we did. So it's a demonstration. I gave $100 to a student, and we'll say a student was Anna. And Anna got $100, but here's the question that I asked students is that how much will this affect GDP as a whole? Now remember that from the last unit we talked about GDP is made up of consumer income plus government spending, consumer spending plus government spending plus investment spending plus net exports. So consumer spending is a big thing in GDP. So if I give $100 to Anna, how much will this affect GDP as a whole? What do you think? Is it going to affect GDP more than $100? Less than $100, or exactly $100? Well, let's take a look at this. So I started off with Anna over here, and I gave her $100. And let's say that, remember that if you have an increase in your disposable income, what can you do with your money? Well, let's assume there's no taxes. I'm going to ignore taxes for a minute. So you can basically go and do what with your money? You can go and spend it, or you can save it, right? So let's say that Anna decides that we're going to have her save 10%. So 10% of $100 is $10. So as a result, the changing in the consumer spending, anything she has left is going to be what she's going to spend. So that means she has $90 left to spend. So she spends $90. So she spends $90, and maybe she spends it at a store where Allie works. And so Allie gets $90. And so that's an increase in her income. So she gets $90, and we're going to keep with that 10%. So 10% of $90 would be that Allie is going to save $9. Okay, she saves $9, and whatever she has left, in this case $81, she is going to spend. So Allie is going to spend $81. And now Allie's going to go to a store, and she's going to spend her $81 with maybe Henry over here. And Henry is also going to get that increase in income, and we're going to say that Henry is going to take that $81 and he's going to save 10% again. So technically 10% is $8.10, but in class we just rounded it because I don't have any pretend change. So we'll go with that as our example. So we're going to say that Henry saves $8. So if he saves $8, that means the rest he has left to spend. So he's going to spend $73, and he's going to spend it at a store that maybe we have Anthony over here that works at. And so Anthony is going to get $73 increase in his income. And so now he's going to save 10%. So 10% of $73 is $7.30. But again, we're going to round it. So we'll round it down to $7. So Anthony's going to save $7. So Anthony saves $7, and that means the rest he has left to spend. So he's going to spend $66, because 73 minus 7 is $66. And maybe Anthony spends his $66 at a store where Paige works. Okay, and Paige is going to get that $66, and she's going to save 10%. So we're going to round that up to $7, so she's going to save $7. And the rest she's going to spend, so that means that the change in consumer spending from Paige is going to be $59. And Paige is going to then spend that $59 at a store where Matt works. And so Matt gets that $59, and he's going to save 10%. So we're going to round that up to $6. He's going to save $6. But he's going to spend the rest, so he's going to spend $53. And maybe he'll spend $53 at a store where Victoria works. And Victoria is going to take that $53 and save 10%, which would be technically $5.30. But we'll round it down to $5. So she's going to save $5, and she's going to spend the rest. So she's going to spend $48. And maybe she'll spend $48 at a store where Joseph works. And so Joseph will get that $48, and he will save 10%, which we'll say is $5, rounding it up. And he'll spend $43. And we could keep going and going and going, and hopefully you see where this is going is that at each round, and as we pass the money on to each person, they spend a little bit less each round. But remember, GDP is about consumer spending. Consumer spending, government spending, investment spending, and net exports. So every time in this red part here that each person is spending, okay, we add that to GDP. So go back to my question. Is our change in GDP going to be exactly $100 because I gave Anna $100, more than $100, or less than $100? Well, hopefully you see I didn't obviously finish this because I could keep going and Joseph could spend $43 and so on until we run out of money. But if you add up all of the red right now, all the stuff that I said spends this amount in red, if you add that up already, that's going to be more than $100. Now, we don't know exactly from this because we didn't finish going through all the rounds how much GDP will change, but we know for sure it's going to be over $100. So how do we actually determine how much is going to be the GDP is going to be changed by? Well, that's where we're going to get into some notes. So income and expenditure is module 16, and the first thing that I have to talk about is the multiplier. So the multiplier is looking at this idea that we just saw from that activity is that there's a change in disposable income. So increasing Anna's income by $100 is going to affect GDP. But the question is by how much? Okay? Because keep in mind that you can either spend it or you can save it. So saving or spending additional income, what should we do? Well, one of the things that you could do is obviously you could save it. So there is something called the marginal propensity to save, or the MPS. Now, I would add this to your equations section of your notebook. So the MPS is simply the change in consumer saving divided by the change in disposable income. So, for example, if I said that I got a raise that increased my income by $500 and I decided to save $100 of it, what is my MPS? Well, my change in consumer savings is $100 because I saved $100 more than whatever I was saving before, divided by my change in disposable income. Well, my disposable income increased by $500. So to figure out my marginal propensity to save, I'm just taking 100 divided by 500, which reduces down to 1/5, which equals out to 0.2. So think of it as 20% of my income I'm going to save. Well, that's not the end of the story, because obviously I could go and save it, or I could go and spend it. So we also have a marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. And MPC is going to be the change in consumer spending divided by the change in disposable income. Notice that this is different than the last equation because we're talking about spending here and not saving. Again, make sure you add this to the equation section of your notebook. So, again, let's go back to my example. If I got a raise that increased my income by $500 and I decided to save $100 of it, what's my MPC now? So if I saved $100, that means I have $400 left to spend because I have $500 total, and if I'm assuming that all I can do is save or spend it, I saved $100, so 500 minus 100 is going to be 400 is how much my consumer spending increased by, divided by the change in disposable income, which is $500. So my MPC is 400 divided by 500, which equals 0.8. Or in other words, 80% of my $500 I'm going to actually spend. Now, you may have noticed that there is a relationship between MPC and MPS. So notice that if I go and add MPS and MPC together, I will get 1. That will always be true. And again, you can add this to your equation section. So this is looking at, if you think about it, it makes sense. For every $1 that I get an increase in income, I'm either going to save it or spend it. So 80 cents of every $1 that I knew I get, 80 cents will go to spending and 20 cents will go to savings. So remember that this helps us to determine how much of it I'm actually going to save or spend. Well, that still doesn't answer my question of how much does it actually increase GDP by? Well, to determine that, now I have to look at the multiplier. And the multiplier is this ratio of the change in GDP caused by an initial change in spending. The initial change in spending is called the autonomous change in aggregate supply, or AAS. It's a fancy word for basically how much your disposable income changed. So the multiplier is looking at how much did that initial change, how much did my $500 raise actually change the GDP. So in order to figure that out, so all we're doing is just like what we did with the activity was that Anna got $100, which she went then and spent and gave to some of it to Allie, who then went and spent some of it and gave it to somebody else, and so on and so on and so on. And so we're just sending around all of this money. So the multiplier, we can actually determine the multiplier by 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Yes, there is an underline under my 1. So again, add this to the equation section of your notebook. 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Now, based on what we just said, MPC, 1 minus MPC, what does that equal? MPS. So you could also say 1 over MPS is also the same as the multiplier. Okay, now that we know that, how does that help us? Okay. Well, when we figure out the total change in GDP from a change in disposable income, we are going to look at how much Y, and by the way, this is how economists actually write what GDP is. And whenever they have an equation that has GDP in it, they will write capital letter Y. So the change in GDP, or the change in capital Y, equals the multiplier, which is 1 over 1 minus MPC, times the initial change in AAS, or in other words, your change in disposable income. So, go back to my example. If I got a raise that increased my income by $500, and I decided to save $100 of it, how much did my GDP increase by? Well, 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, which is 1 minus 0.8, because we already determined our MPC, times my initial 500 will give us $2,500. So my $500 raise will actually go and increase GDP by $2,500. All right, now hopefully you got all that. So let's go back to that beginning demonstration. I started off by giving Anna $100 and she saved 10% of it, and it snowballed from there. So see if you can calculate the MPS, the MPC, and how much total change in GDP there is from my $100. So pause the video right now, see if you can figure that out, and then play it again to see if you're right. Okay, hopefully by now you've calculated the MPS, the MPC, and the total change in GDP from my initial $400. So, answers. So, calculating the MPS. Remember, MPS is the change in savings divided by the change in disposable income. So, our change in savings was $10 more divided by $100, which is our change in income. So MPS is 10 divided by 100, which is 0.1 or 10%. MPC is going to be the change in consumer spending. So we saved $10. That means we had $90 to spend, divided by $100, which is our change in income. So MPC is 90 divided by 100, which is 0.9. Finally, calculate the total change in GDP from my $100. To calculate this, remember we're taking our multiplier, which is 1 over 1 minus MPC. Oops, sorry, that should say MPC. Times our $100. So this is going to be the change in Y, which is our GDP, is 1 over 1 minus 0.9 times 100. So 1 over 1 minus 0.9, 1 minus 0.9 is 0.1. So 1 over 0.1 times 100, which equals $1,000. All right, hopefully that went well. Let me know if you have any questions.